And what a horrific thing to approach. Enormous scandal. It really is one of the most devastating, horrific scandals of modern British political history. But because of the fact that it makes you feel a bit icky, you don't want to touch it.
And it's going to have this weak leadership again. It's because they're thinking about it through this politician's lens rather than an ordinary person's lens. It's actually going to have the opposite effect of the one that they want to have. It's going to cost them votes.
But going after an Israeli for the fact that they might have served in the IDF is like singling out a Brit for paying a TV licence. It's compulsory.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. Delighted to be joined as ever in the studio with Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And absolutely thrilled to be joined down the line by former British Army officer Andrew Fox. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, good to be here.
So plenty to discuss today. In the first half of the pod, we'll be talking about the grooming-gang's inquiry and its collapse, how Graham Linehan's arrest might sink the non-crime hate incident, and the Jew hunt at City University. But that's not all. If you're a Spike supporter, immediately after this, you can watch our exclusive bonus episode where we'll be talking about the latest from the Maccabee Tel Aviv scandal. We'll discuss the Gaza ceasefire and what's going on there. And finally, we'll discuss the big hoo-ha at the Oxford Union. So the Labour government's grooming gangs inquiry looks like it's on the verge of collapse. We've had, at the time of recording, it could be more by the time you're watching this, 5 of the survivors have resigned from the victims liaison panel. Many of the potential chairs do not want to be involved. There is a huge amount of focus, particularly on Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips. People are accusing her of misinformation about the victims. She's been accused of trying to manipulate the panel away from the subject of grooming specifically, the grooming gang specifically. Tom, what have you made of it so far?
I mean, it's grimly predictable, really, that the inquiry has kind of fallen apart before it's even begun. I mean, the Labour Party was dragged kicking and screaming into calling for this national inquiry. People will remember Keir Starmer referring to people calling for one as jumping on a far-right bandwagon, just months before he finally acquiesced to actually putting this together. And the concerns that the victims, the survivors, have come forward with are precisely the sorts of things you can imagine the Labour Party dragging their feet over. There's been this specific concern about who is going to chair the panel. So far, many of the candidates have been people who've come out of the police or come out of social services. So for understandable reasons, given up and down the country, we know both police and social services were complicit in the cover-up of these horrific industrial-scale abuse of young girls. You can totally understand that. And the other aspect of this, which is something that really seems to touch on Jess Phillips and what role she may or may not have played in all this, is the allegation that there's been this attempt to kind of broaden the scope of the inquiry, to broaden it to other forms of sexual abuse, which the survivors quite understandably are saying this is an attempt to dilute what it is that they're looking at, specifically to kind of downplay any racial or religious dimensions to this, because we know from Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford and all the rest of it that particularly Pakistani Muslim men are disproportionately represented amongst the perpetrators, and that certainly played a role in why the police and social services and everyone else were so keen to cover it up. The old saw about community cohesion, community tensions being raised time and again as a justification for not pursuing these perpetrators. And the fact that Jess Phillips in the Houses of Commons was saying that these claims were untrue, and it was only a matter of hours basically until there was some good reporting that found that what these survivors were saying was true.
Yeah.
I think it's playing into a concern that has haunted this inquiry from the very off, which is that this was a scandal which was generated in large part in Labour areas. It was covered up because you had Labour politicians as well as local civil servants who felt that they couldn't touch this issue because it kind of offended all of their multicultural sensibilities. And they've got a Labour Party presiding over an inquiry which seems to want to engage in a kind of version of the same cover-up again. So you can only hope that things will get back on track. But it's I think that kind of fundamental lack of trust is now going to be really difficult for them to get over.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, that's the key issue at the heart of this. The Labour government didn't want this inquiry, and so that's probably why it's done a terrible job and looks like it's trying to distract from the core reasons that we need to have it so badly.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what? I always lean towards, when something happens like this, attributing it to incompetence over malice. That's kind of my default position. But there are really 2 things that jump out of me over this. And the first one is how appalling it must be for one of the survivors to have been through this horrific experience, be ignored for so long, finally get the inquiry that you really want to make sure that the crimes that you suffered were exposed and hopefully dealt with in a better way, and only to have this kind of political nonsense descend upon you where it becomes a party political election issue rather than about actually finding justice for you. I really do feel for those survivors and the position they've been put in here. And the second thing is that just almost as everything else that's gone wrong for this Labour government, it's just terrible, weak leadership. It's an inability to make this decisive, correct call because you're far too worried about your electorate or the constituencies that these crimes happened in, or or similar. And what it needs here is just decisive, strong leadership. And instead, we've just got this horrible weather vaning approach from Number 10, where they're either unwilling or unable just to grip this issue and make it happen. And that worries me that we don't have that at the top of our country.
Absolutely. And it seems their sort of equivocation is actually insulting to everyone because clearly, ordinary Muslims are not offended by the prospect of rooting out rapists. It's an absurd idea that people would stop voting for the Labour Party, for instance, if you were to arrest these horrible, horrible men or to get to the bottom of these terrible, terrible crimes. And then on the other side, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, if you're concerned about this issue, then you're considered to be part of the far right. In Keir Starmer's own words.
And I think, without wanting to sound too party political about it, I think part of the hesitancy is also the fact that Labour are kind of implicated at top to bottom of all of this. I mean, this is something which was taking place in many kind of predominantly Labour-controlled areas, whether that's in terms of councils, whether that's in terms of the MPs. I mean, that's been a little bit scrambled by recent years since Brexit, but you are talking about the Red Wall, you are talking about northern towns, you are talking about, not exclusively, but certainly that's where some of the most grotesque kind of cover-ups had taken place. And you can't help but feel that that's part of the picture here. I mean, I tend to think that when it comes to Labour's betrayal of the working class, and there's been many of those over the years, but if you think about Brexit and the kind of betrayal of the working class's kind of democratic right to decide the future of their nation, and then you've got the grooming gangs insofar as just the Labour Party kind of happily presiding over, or turning a blind eye to, I should say, the kind of industrial scale abuse of some of the most genuinely vulnerable people in society, young girls, working class, often very poor, in fact, in care in the system. It's impossible, I think, for them to kind of digest this, partly for the reasons of kind of political correctness, which have washed throughout this whole shameful scandal. But I think also because maybe deep down they know that there's going to be some pretty damning things coming out about this, about who knew what when, or who turned a blind eye, or who couldn't be bothered to even look at some of these issues in too much detail because they were worried about what they might find. So there's always going to be all kinds of different motivations. Not all of them are necessarily going to be that conscious. But I think it's interesting seeing how kind of defensive Jess Phillips in particular is on this question, because she is someone who, all of her career out of Parliament was very much in the kind of the anti kind of violence against women and girls sector. That is very much her passion. And yet because of the combination of the sensitivities so-called around this particular form of offending, because of which ethnic groups are disproportionately represented in them, and also because of the fact that there are many damning conclusions potentially for Labour, there's almost it's a kind of defensiveness and a prickliness derived from the fact that they like to think of themselves as having the moral high ground on this issue, and suddenly they've been shown not to actually have been engaged in a quite morally depraved cover-up at one level or another. So they can keep trying to say that, oh, this is the Tories just trying to sling mud at us, but I don't think that's working. I think people kind of see that this is a problem that Labour are just almost constitutionally incapable of looking into in any serious way.
Tom, this is looking at it through a politician's lens. Everything you've just described is a politician's lens rather than a kind of ordinary human being's lens. And I don't mean that to be disparaging of all politicians, but this is really looking at it as a party political issue. And going back to my earlier point and kind of segueing into yours as well, this is actually going to hurt them more at the ballot box in the long run. We talk about, you talked about the betrayal of the working class. Now look at Wales. I can tell you, I've lived in South Wales. It's a home from home to me. I went to university there. I lived there in the army, and you can see those communities falling apart around you because there's just no economy, nothing there at all. And as a result, for the first time in over 100 years, most of Wales is now going to leave Labour, and it looks like they're going to go reform. And so that's the political cost of not dealing with this problem. And by the same token, if I'm a Labour Party member, the last thing I want is people in my party who covered this stuff up to remain in my party. You'd be really keen, wouldn't you, to say, my God, if we've been down this road where our Labour councillors have made these decisions and have led to this horrific scandal, I'd want them investigated, found out, and removed. And, it's going to have this weak leadership again. It's because they're thinking about it through this politician's lens rather than an ordinary person's lens. It's actually going to have the opposite effect of the one that they want to have. It's going to cost them votes.
And Tom, before we move on, I think it would be worth talking about Jess Phillips a bit more specifically, just because, she is someone who I think whenever something happens that might possibly have a connection to Muslims and Islam, she seems incapable of saying anything. I mean, people might recall her appearance on Question Time during or Migrants as well, this group that she will not dare touch, when she downplayed the mass rape and sexual assaults of women in Cologne on that New Year's Eve, and she talked about it as the equivalent of being catcalled on in Birmingham. And there's been there's been plenty of examples like that where she's just shied away because of those sort of sensitivities, as you might crudely put it.
No, and some people would lay the blame of the fact that she is a Birmingham MP. She's got many Muslims in her constituency. She obviously had a pretty close run at the last election from one of those kind of pro-Gaza candidates who gave her quite a run for her money, and there was a lot of dirty tricks that were practiced there, and even there she kind of struggled to condemn it as kind of sectarian. I think she said these are just kind of men menacing me rather than anything else. I don't think that's necessarily purely because of the fact that the individuals involved, whether we're talking about the horrific Cologne sex attacks, whether we're talking about the grooming gangs, or whether we're talking about the sectarian politics, which has almost bit her and many other people in the Labour Party. It's not strictly necessarily the question they're Muslim, but because of the fact that I think there is this kind of multicultural lens through which they view everything, they struggle to talk about things in a kind of specific way. You'll often hear, not necessarily from Jess Phillips, I don't think, but from a lot of people in this discussion, they'll throw this back at the right or people who have been raising the issue of grooming gangs and say, you only care about sexual assault when it's a Pakistani doing it or a Muslim doing it. I mean, it's a disgraceful accusation anyway. But nevertheless, I think you turn it around on them. You do not care about this particular form of abuse because of who the perpetrators disproportionately seem to be. And what a horrific thing to approach an enormous scandal. It really is one of the most devastating, horrific scandals of modern British political history, in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of victims. But because of the fact that it makes you feel a bit icky, you don't want to touch it. You'd happily have it covered up. You would happily turn a blind eye to these crimes and to the people who allowed it to happen for decades upon decades upon decades. I mean, in certain places, this abuse became generational. A mother and a daughter suffering the same kind of abuse. So I think it's just that way in which the reason they always feel the need to generalize it, to kind of talk about all forms of abuse and what have you, is because on these particular issues that they are paralyzed by that kind of political correctness. I don't think it's necessarily malign, but it certainly has kind of malign effects as a consequence of that, if you see what I mean.
Let's talk about Graham Linehan. Some good news for once. Around 7 weeks after he was arrested, after 5 armed police officers turned up to greet him at Heathrow Airport to arrest him for some tweets, the Met Police have finally said they're not going to take any action against him. And further to that, they're also going to stop investigating non-crime hate incidents. Now, non-crime hate incident is a funny thing. It's quite hard to explain what it is. It's sort of a policing tool that allows them to record things. It might be speech, might be behavior that doesn't meet the criminal threshold, but is perceived by someone. Doesn't even have to be a victim, but perceived by someone, whoever is doing the reporting to the police, as hateful in some way. Andrew, first of all, what's your reaction to this? I mean, it is good to see the police lay off a little bit on the speech policing for once.
Yeah, I mean, this is finally justice done for, and it's great to see. And, it's that classic thing where, you might not agree with what somebody says, but you'll fight to the death for their right to say it. And I think we're in that space where that saying needs to be kind of have a raging comeback in 2025. And actually, I think he'd be hard pressed to take a huge offence at what he said in those tweets anyway, even if you were, offence driven. This is pretty banal stuff, if we're honest. There's plenty of worse stuff that's said on the internet than what Graham said. So when it comes to the sort of the non-crime hate incidents, it's such a new Labourism, and it's an attempt to try and make everyone see the world the way they do. And it goes back to what you were just saying about Jess Phillips and how she sees the world. And I think when you're from a position perhaps of a more libertarian nature, these things are completely alien to you. If you're from a sort of hard socialist kind of position, they make an enormous amount of sense because you're helping shape and mold society, and that's kind of how sort of that left wing progressive element works. But it's just antithetical to anyone who believes in freedom of speech or the ability to carry out your life without too much state interference.
The police, their excuse is that they're necessary to sort of detect when hatefulness or racism or whatever might be bubbling up in an area. So they record these non-crime hate incidents, and that should give them police intelligence. I mean, I've seen absolutely no evidence that that is how they work, or that is effective. Presumably, they wouldn't have predicted last year's anti-migrant riots, for instance. That, you know,
Especially if you look at some of the examples. I mean,
Yeah.
they're risible. You know, the schoolgirl who said one of her classmates smelled like fish, that was a non-crime hate. Were they terrified that was going to turn into some kind of pogrom against people who smell like fish if they hadn't, you know, recorded that dutifully? The guy who was whistling Bob the Builder was recorded as a non-crime hate incident. I think his neighbour was Polish. Was it a Polish builder joke? Who the hell knows? But these are not kind of serious indications of unrest. And the other thing is that, of course, the police are going to collect intelligence and all kinds of things, but it went further than that. It was a way in which people were kind of quasi-criminalised for what
Yeah.
they said, because yes, you wouldn't be arrested or prosecuted for a non-crime hate incident. The clue is in the name, non-crime. But at the same time, it would go down on your record. If you applied for a job which required an enhanced DBS check, it could flag up. And if you're trying to be a school teacher or something, you know, where you in the public sector or what have you, there's very likely that that could deprive you of a job. It was also very clear that they had been kind of weaponized by people with an axe to grind all the time. There was the non-crime hate incident recorded against Amber Rudd, the former Home Secretary, over a speech she gave about immigration. Because I think it was an Oxford academic reported her for that. And he later admitted that he hadn't actually heard the speech himself. He just didn't like the sound of it from the media coverage. So it's been a farce from start to finish. And I worry that the farce is going to continue because the Met have said that they're not going to investigate them.
Yeah.
They're going to continue to record them, however, and they still haven't clarified that, for instance, they're not going to feed that information through to DBS, the
Yeah.
people who do DBS checks. So it's one of those things where I think that they wanted to kind of make a kind of statement, particularly because the Graham Linehan arrest was so heavy-handed. 5 armed police officers. He was held in a cell for hours upon hours. And that really kind of shocked not just people in Britain but around the world. So I guess they wanted to do something to kind of save face.
Yeah.
Didn't relate to his particular offence because obviously that was actually criminal, or supposedly. But that
Well,
it's
they downgraded it. So what happened was they decided it wasn't criminal. Then they downgraded it to a non-crime hate incident, and then now they've made this announcement.
But it's one of those things where the story of the non-crime hate incident is it continuing to limp on even when there have been attempts to get rid of it, you know. And I think that's the part of the problem is it's a reminder that the problem is with the culture within the police and the kind of quite anti-free speech and also just very peculiar sort of notions they picked up over the past 20 years. Until that's tackled, you're going to get, even if they get rid of NCHRs and call them something else,
Yeah.
you'll get something like it.
We'll still, of course, have all of the laws that do literally criminalise
of course.
speech, from the Communications Act to the Malicious Communications Act to the Online Safety Act to the Public Order Act that I'm sure people have heard us talk about many times before. I mean, you're absolutely right, Tom, to say that, you know, this is not the first time the death of the non-crime hate incident has been declared. Now, these were, it's bizarre actually, because these were not, they didn't come from Parliament. No actual elected person has ever said that these things need to exist. They're inspired by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and then basically put into guidance by the College of Policing in 2014 or 2015. And there have been several court cases where judges have said this is not lawful to record these things. There have been multiple Home Secretaries that have said the police need to stop recording non-crime hate incidents. Priti Patel in 2021, I think it was, said that all non-crime hate incidents should be expunged from the record. Didn't happen. The police did not ignore, they ignored the orders of Home Secretaries, the Court of Appeal, the High Court, and yet it carries on as a sort of law unto itself. As you say, Tom, because this is the culture in policing where they believe it is their actual solemn, sacred duty almost to tell us what we can and can't think. Andrew, what do you make of that aspect of it, where it's just the police have just completely lost the plot and have been completely captured by woke?
Well, look, I think the College of Policing have an awful lot to answer for. I think if you went up to any random police officer on the street and asked them how they felt about this, and they could answer you with no comebacks, they would tell you it's nonsense and they didn't join the job to go and police this stuff, and they want to go out and catch criminals. I think at the kind of beat level that this is nothing that anyone wants to do, be it the person on the wrong end of it or the cop who is told to go and deal with it. But the College of Policing is certainly, I think, institutionally captured. An awful lot of the nonsense that comes out stems from that organisation. And really that's the bit that I think needs looking at. And when it comes to, recording this stuff, capturing this stuff, it's a really great example, I think, of how well-meaning, very broad decisions can be exposed and be exploited by malign actors. Because I know for the Linehan case, the way they phrased the complaint was very careful. They had lawyers involved when they submitted the complaint to the police. It's not like somebody saw it online and was immediately like, 999, I've been upset. There was a very cynical kind of correct language to trigger all the buttons in the process to make sure the police could then, if they didn't investigate, the police could then be investigated themselves. So that it's very cleverly weaponized by these people. And that's the problem when you don't have legislation underpinning it, I think, because you can go to court, you can have the judge look at what Parliament intended when the original legislation was written, and the judge can then make a decision as to what politicians actually meant and therefore what this means. But when you go through this kind of here's a decision we've made internally, now do what you want, then it's so broad, and so, you can drive a bus through it when it comes to exploiting it and weaponizing it for malign reasons. So, we go back to that Tony Blair piece of taking away parliamentary sovereignty. I think if we could just return to, and stop all these independent bodies and things making these decisions and just return to legislation, where a political party is elected to do something, they make the law, and then the police enforce the law, then that would simplify and avoid a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And we should probably say before we move on that we are about to release our documentary all about this topic. So think before you post, look out for it on Monday at 8 p.m. We've got interviewed a series of these supposed speech criminals just to kind of wrap our heads around the experience of going through that process of getting the proverbial knock at the door, but also how the hell we got into this situation where 30 arrests a day now, or what made under communications offences for saying offensive things on the internet. So yeah, look out for that on Monday night.
So we should talk about this really horrific story from City University of London, or City St George's University of London, I should call it with its new name, where a Jewish Israeli professor, Michael Ben-Gad, has been hounded by pro-Palestine students, basically because he, as an Israeli Jew, as pretty much all Israeli Jews do, served in the IDF when he was, back in the 1980s, I think it was, when, back at home. Students have been protesting against him. They've been calling for him to be sacked. There have been people saying he should be beheaded. Tom, what the hell is going on here? I mean, if this isn't anti-Semitism, then I don't know what is.
No, it's a Jew hunt, plain and simple. I mean, they have targeted him purely on the basis of who he is. I mean, to people who are completely oblivious to Israel, or completely oblivious to this issue, maybe they could be convinced by this horrendous propaganda they've been spewing out that he's got blood in his hands, he's some kind of terrorist. But going after an Israeli for the fact that they might have served in the IDF is like singling out a Brit for paying a TV license. It's compulsory. It's one of those. It's a thinly veiled excuse to go after someone because of who they are rather than anything that they've done. As you say, he served back in the 1980s. This is decades before the Israel-Hamas war. This is decades before these Jew-baiting little scroats who are running after him were even born.
Yeah.
It's absolutely absurd. And it's part of a broader pattern, which is that not just since October the 7th, but before as well, it was increasingly very difficult to be certainly Israeli Jewish, but just Jewish, even, British Jewish even.
Yeah.
At a British university. I mean, the number of times that you saw, particularly in London, though not exclusively, invited speakers being hounded out, not because they were representatives of the government or of the embassy necessarily, but just because of the fact that by dint of their service in the IDF, that could be enough of a reason to get up one of these hate campaigns and convince some idiots that you should go and let off flares and chant anti-Semitic slogans at them. So it's really alarming. I mean, he's sticking up for himself. He's refused to go on paid leave. He says the university's been very good with him. There's also been hundreds of academics who have signed a open letter in solidarity with him, which is very encouraging to see. But being Jewish at a British university shouldn't require such kind of balls of steel in order to get in. Yet that's the situation that we found ourselves in, unfortunately. And if you look at those videos as well, I mean, running around disrupting an Israeli Jewish man's lecture, calling him a terrorist, threatening to behead him whilst wearing a balaclava. The fact that these people think they're on the right side of history while doing any of that is baffling.
Yeah.
But it's that combination, that zealotry and that idiocy, which seems to be the kind of feeding ground for this new anti-Semitism.
Yeah, look, this is all part of the wider campaign against Israel. And, we're going to talk about the mighty Aston Villa in a moment. But even today, Ayub Khan came out and said, yeah, actually, now we want to get Israel banned from all sporting events. So literally last week, he was saying it was about the safety of local people and fan safety. And now straight away, he's pivoted to ban everything. And look, I've commented on this conflict for 2 years now. And for the most part, the kind of the people I've upset have been Owen Jones and his chums. But the one time I actually got kind of a bit of flack from the Israeli side is when I said, look, at the moment, your international isolation is going to be a bigger threat to you in due course than Hamas, because this campaign is specifically designed to degrade Israel's standing on the international stage to the point where you've got organizations like the Heinrich Jab Foundation, which has indirect links to Hezbollah, is trawling Israeli social media, finding IDF soldiers who are on holiday wherever, and then trying to weaponize local law enforcement against them for war crimes. You've got this sort of stuff happening in London where they're trying to make it impossible to be an Israeli working outside of Israel. And what they're trying to do is create another ghetto. This is what anti-Semites have done throughout history, except this time the ghetto is going to be the state of Israel if they get their way. And the only saving grace is that now the ghetto is very heavily armed. But this is their intention: is to kind of degrade Israel so much on the international stage that Israelis can go in Israel and nowhere else.
I think it's just so important now that people take a stand against this stuff. So if you're in the university sector, as I say, this has been going on for a very long time. There's been about 117% rise in anti-Semitic incidents on campus, according to the Community Security Trust, since October the 7th. But having written a lot about the kind of free speech on campus issue, the particular violence and poison which would attend any kind of Jewish student or pro-Israel event, it was on a scale that, it really was above and beyond even what you saw in relation to the kind of gender critical issue. And it's been that way for a very long time. So I think now is the time for students, academics, administrators even really to stand up, because this is just Jew hatred with a keffiyeh lightly draped over it. And if you're not going to root it out, when? Because Andrew's exactly right. This is a longer running campaign. There's a lot of people in academia who've been convinced of the fact that it's totally fine and normal and not at all prejudiced to single out one nation and one nation in particular for academic boycotts and so on and so forth. This has been going on in the academy for a very long time, but we're now seeing the racist fruits of it. So yeah, now is the time to stand up, definitely.
There's a theme that links everything that we're talking about here, from the keffiyeh or the hipster swastika, as I've seen it called, which I quite like. If we look at the grooming-gang scandal, if we look at the banning of an Israeli, or an attempted removal of an Israeli professor, it's about stopping your opponents from speaking. It all goes back to this kind of leftist approach where you shut down your opponent because you can't deal with their arguments. Their arguments to you are someone disagreeing with you is so heinously wrong that you're trying to shut them up. And it's a mindset, I think. But Israel has then bolted on to that these decades or centuries of anti-Semitism. And so particularly when it comes to Israel, you're seeing an absolute bin fire when it comes to trying to talk about the topic, and the left trying to just shut you down completely to the point where they want rid of everything related to do with Israel from any country that's not Israel itself.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Tom. Now, our conversation does not end there, because if you're a Spiked supporter, you can join us for Spiked Podcast Unlocked, which you can now find on the homepage. And if you're not, then why not become a supporter? Because you want to see the rest of this conversation. You can sign up now at spiked-online.com/support. So see the rest of you at Spiked Podcast Unlocked. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked Podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.